In the autumn of 1883, the county of Harlan in eastern Kansas held a dispersal auction on the failed Dressler homestead. By mid-morning, the livestock had sold, the tools had sold, and the grain wagon had sold to a man from the next county over, who paid 4 times what it was worth, because 2 other men wanted it. What remained when the crowd began to thin was the silo, a round stone and mortar structure 40 feet tall that had been built badly to begin with and had spent the last decade leaning 3 degrees off plumb toward the southeast. The auctioneer named the opening price and paused. Nobody moved. He named it again, lower. A woman at the back of the crowd raised her hand. Her name was Dora Vance. She was 27 years old, slight in build, not quite 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she had arrived at the auction that morning wearing a cream-colored pioneer dress with a small blue floral print, a vivid red wool shawl drawn close against the October air, and a worn leather satchel at her hip that she had carried since she was 19. The satchel had belonged to her father. Most of what was in it had also belonged to her father. She had $1.60 in her coat pocket and a second dollar folded into the satchel's inner lining. When the gavel came down, she had spent $2.40 total, and the leaning silo at the edge of the Dressler property was hers. The men around her laughed. One of them, a feed merchant named Purdy, said she had just bought herself a pile of rocks waiting to fall. Another said at least she would not have far to walk when it came down on top of her. The auctioneer himself, a man named Goss who wore a hat 2 sizes too large, looked at her for a moment with something between pity and amusement. She did not look back. She wrote her name in the ledger, accepted the deed, and folded it into the satchel beside the extra dollar she had not needed. If you have ever stood at the edge of something everyone else walked away from and felt not doubt but a particular kind of quiet certainty, then you already understand something about her. Leave a word below about a thing you saw the value in when others did not. What she did on the Dressler land in the weeks that followed is a story that took 26 years to tell in full. But it begins with that silo, and it begins with what her father taught her in the last year of his life. Martin Vance had been a mason, not a decorative mason, not a man who laid brick for the facades of courthouses or the ornamental borders of garden paths. He was a structural mason, a man who understood the way weight moved through stone and mortar, where it distributed and where it concentrated, what a wall wanted to do when it was loaded, and what you had to do to make it want something else. He had worked quarries in Ohio and river crossings in Missouri, and had come to Kansas in 1868 with a knowledge of stone construction that was not common on the prairie, where most men built in timber because timber was familiar. He taught Dora not by formal instruction but by working beside her, naming what he saw and what it meant. She had set mortar before she was 15. She could read a wall the way a reader reads a page, scanning for where the sentence had gone wrong, where the weight had been miscalculated, or the footing set too shallow, or the mortar mixed too wet for the climate. One particular lesson had stayed with her more than any other. She was 16, and they were assessing a root cellar on a farmstead south of the Drover Road, a stone-walled room sunk 4 feet into the earth and roofed with heavy timber that had begun to press the walls outward at the top. The farmer wanted to know if it was safe. He walked the perimeter of the cellar in silence for several minutes, pressing his palm against the walls at intervals, crouching to look at the footing where it met the earth floor. Then he straightened and said to the farmer that the cellar was not in danger of collapse. The farmer asked how he could know that with such certainty. Martin told him that the walls were moving the same amount in opposite directions, which meant the timber load was distributed evenly, and that a load distributed evenly is a load that is being carried. It is an uneven load that kills a wall, not a heavy one. The farmer accepted this. Dora, standing a few feet away with the measuring string, wrote it down in the small notebook she carried. Not the conclusion, but the method. Read the pattern of movement, not just the movement itself. A structure that moves uniformly tells you one thing. A structure that moves unevenly tells you something else entirely. It was the same principle she had applied to the leaning silo in June, standing at the edge of the road in the summer heat with the lime cart behind her. The lean was regular. The whole southeastern face had shifted together, as a unit, by the same degree. No cracking at the base, no buckling in the upper courses, no differential settlement between one side and the other. A lean like that had a single cause and a single location, and it was not the foundation. Martin died in the spring of 1879. He left Dora his tools, his satchel, and a set of hand-drawn notes on structural assessment that he had composed across several notebooks over his working life. He left her nothing else because there was nothing else to leave. She had worked as an assessor's aide for 2 years after his death, measuring and recording the condition of structures for a county office that paid her half what it paid the men who did the same work. When that office changed its administration and the new administrator brought his own aides, she was released without notice or payment for her final week. She spent the summer of 1883 doing piece labor, patching chimneys and relaying hearthstones for farmsteads along the Drover Road, and she came to the Dressler auction in October with $2.60 and a specific purpose. She had seen the silo in June, passing on the road with a cartload of lime for a job 3 miles east. She had looked at it for a long time. Its lean was visible from the road, the southeast face of the round tower canting perceptibly away from true vertical, and any ordinary assessment would have named it a liability. What she saw, looking at it from the road in the June light, was that the lean was regular, not the chaotic, spreading lean of a structure whose foundation was giving way beneath it. A regular lean, one that had been present for years and had not progressed, which meant the foundation was sound. The deviation was in the wall construction itself, in a section of the mortar course near the base that had been laid without enough lime content for the Kansas freeze-thaw cycle, and had compressed unevenly over time. She had noted the section, noted the approximate degree of lean, noted that the stone itself was good limestone fitted with care, and she had gone on to her job. When she learned in September that the Dressler land was to be auctioned, she went home and looked at her father's notebooks for an hour before she slept. The property deed gave her the silo and the 30-foot radius of land immediately surrounding it. Nothing else. She walked the perimeter the morning after the auction, the red shawl pulled tight, the satchel at her hip, the October frost still on the grass. The silo stood at the eastern edge of what had been the Dressler planting fields, now going to thistle. Up close, it was larger than it looked from the road. The stone courses were 30 inches thick at the base, good limestone hauled from the Cedar Bluffs 8 miles north, and the builder, whoever he had been, had known enough to key the courses at the corners, even though a round structure had no true corners. The southeast face showed the compression she had identified in June. She ran her hand along the mortar joint and felt the familiar soft sag of undercalcined mix, mortar that had never fully cured and had spent 15 years settling under load. The surrounding courses were sound. The foundation stones where they met the soil were set deep and true. She pressed the flat of her palm against the base and felt nothing move. What no one who had laughed at her purchase had considered, and what she had not said aloud because there was no advantage in saying it, was simply this. A stone silo built to the proportions of the Dressler structure did not become a silo in the usual sense by the work of the builder alone. A silo of this diameter and height, if the construction had been done with any competence at the laying stage, would have included internal features that a surface inspection from the outside could not reveal. Her father's notes on granary and storage construction, derived from his work on 2 large farm operations in central Ohio, described a practice that had been common among German immigrant builders in the 1860s. They called it the partition floor, a horizontal stone ledge built into the interior wall at roughly the halfway height of the structure that divided the interior into 2 chambers. The lower chamber served ordinary grain storage. The upper chamber, accessible only by an interior ladder or a hatch cut into the partition floor, served a separate purpose entirely: dry goods, seed reserve, and in some cases documentation, records, papers that a farmer needed to keep dry, sealed and removed from the daily traffic of the lower chamber. The Dressler family had emigrated from Baden in 1861. She had learned this from the county assessor's index. She had also learned in the course of her 2 years of aid work that the Dressler homestead had been acquired under a federal preemption claim in 1864, and that the claim had been contested in 1871 by a land company called the Meridian Valley Agricultural Corporation, which had argued through a lawyer in Topeka that the original preemption filing contained an error in the survey description that rendered it invalid, and that the land therefore reverted to open entry. The Dresslers had lost the contest at the county level, then won a partial reversal at the state level, then lost again when the company filed a second suit naming a different survey error. The land they had been permitted to keep under the partial reversal was the eastern third of their original claim, which comprised the silo ground, a strip of field, and the road-facing edge of what had been their homestead. The western 2/3, which included the farmhouse and the well in the best soil, had been absorbed by Meridian Valley in 1874. The Dresslers had farmed the remaining eastern third for 9 years, and then, with age and debt and the death of the elder Dressler in 1882, had let it go to auction. None of this was secret knowledge. It was in the county records, distributed across 3 ledgers and a file of court correspondence that the assessor's office kept in a cabinet in the back corner of the records room, a cabinet that nobody in the current office appeared to open with any regularity. She had opened it. She had been assigned to take an inventory of the cabinet's contents in the summer of 1880 as part of her aid work, and what she had expected to find was the sort of routine paper accumulation that every county office generated: deed transfers, survey plats, tax receipts, the occasional boundary dispute. What she had found instead was a nearly complete record of the Dressler contest, including the correspondence between the county clerk and the state land office, the filings by the Meridian Valley lawyer, and a handwritten note in the margin of one of the county clerk's internal memoranda that read simply, "Second survey error seems unlikely to coexist with first." The clerk who had written it had not acted on the observation. He had filed it and gone on to other things. Dora had copied the note into her own small notebook and had thought about it on and off in the 3 years since. What she had not been able to determine from the records alone was whether the survey errors the Meridian Valley Corporation had cited were genuine or manufactured. Survey descriptions in preemption filings were notoriously imprecise, and a sufficiently motivated company with access to a skilled surveyor could find or fabricate a discrepancy in almost any filing from the 1860s. The Dressler case had the character of a manufactured contest. The second suit, filed only after the partial reversal, had cited a different error in a different section of the same filing, which was an unusual approach if both errors were genuine, since a legitimate surveyor would have identified both at once. She could not prove this from the public records. The public records showed only the outcome, which was the land transfer, the court decisions, and the final reduced holding. If there was proof of the original fraud, it would be in the original survey documents themselves, the field notes and the traverse calculations that a surveyor produced before reducing them to the clean description in the filing. Those documents, if they survived, would be the kind of thing a cautious farmer might have kept somewhere dry and inaccessible, somewhere like the upper chamber of a stone silo with a partition floor. She brought her tools on the third morning, the iron bar, the hand level, the shorter of her two pry tools, and the coil of rope her father had used for measuring long distances. She wore the red shawl and the satchel in her heaviest boots. The silo had a single entry door at ground level, iron-strapped oak, locked with a padlock to which she had no key. She had bought the structure without the lock, a gap in the deed language that she had noticed and decided not to raise with the auctioneer. She worked the door's lower hinge with the iron bar for 40 minutes. The hinge pin came free in a spray of rust flakes, and she lifted the door off its frame and set it aside against the stone wall. She stood in the open doorway for a moment before she entered. The October air was cold, and the air coming from the interior was colder. The particular cold of enclosed stone that has not seen sun for a long time. A cold with a mineral smell to it, chalky and faintly earthy. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of her father's work sites, of the quarry face and the cellar floor, of the underside of a bridge arch in early spring. She stepped inside. The interior was dark beyond the reach of the doorway light. She'd brought a small oil lamp which she set on the earthen floor and lit, and in its light the interior of the silo resolved in a slow circle, revealing the curved stone wall, the earthen floor, the debris of abandoned storage, and above all of it the faint suggestion of height, the walls rising into a darkness the lamp could not reach. She stood still for a moment and listened. The silo made no sound. The walls were thick enough to absorb the October wind that had been pushing at her coat on the walk from the road, and inside there was only the small noise of the lamp flame, and once a dry scratching that she identified as a field mouse somewhere in the old sacking against the far wall. She took out the hand level and held it against the interior wall face and read the bubble. The interior wall, unlike the exterior, was dead plumb. The compression in the outer mortar course had canted the exterior face, while the interior had been locked by the partition structure above. She looked up. The partition floor was there. 12 feet above ground level hung a ring of flat limestone slabs, each perhaps 2 feet wide and 4 inches thick, keyed into the interior wall at intervals and mortared in place. The slabs did not meet at the center. They left a circular opening roughly 3 feet in diameter at the midpoint of the chamber, and from the lip of that opening hung an iron ladder, hook-pinned to the nearest slab, its rungs descending to within 4 feet of the earthen floor. The lower 2 rungs had rusted through and fallen. She looked at the ladder for a long moment. Then she unknotted the coil of rope from her satchel and made a loop. The work of the next 2 days was methodical and deliberate, and at times hard. The first day she cleared the lower chamber of the debris that had accumulated there. Old grain sacking, a broken-handled scoop, 2 wooden staves from a split barrel, and a quantity of chaff that had hardened in the moisture of several winters into a layer she broke up with the iron bar and shoveled out in sections. It took most of the morning. The work raised a fine dust that settled on the red shawl and grated, and she paused at midday to step outside and shake it clean in the wind, then went back in. She ate a piece of cornbread sitting on the doorstep with the lamp behind her and the draft coming through. And she looked out at the Dressler fields going to thistle in the October light, and thought about Friedrich Dressler building his partition floor alone in the last winter before the suits began. A man who could not have been certain the suits would come, or perhaps a man who had been watching the Meridian Valley Corporation work its way across eastern Kansas and had understood what certainty looked like from the outside. She did not think he had been a man easily given to panic. The partition floor, what she had seen of it from below, was good work. The limestone slabs were well selected, consistent in thickness, and the keying into the interior wall was precise. A man in a hurry builds what he needs and stops. A man who trusts the work builds it right. The latter concerned her. The 4 upper rungs, though rust-pocked, held when she tested them with her full weight suspended from the rope tied to the outside of the doorframe. She ran her hand along each rung in turn, feeling for the soft spot that preceded failure in iron, left too long in moisture, and found none. The rust was surface rust, the kind that forms a protective layer and stops. The iron beneath was still solid. The gap left by the 2 missing lower rungs she bridged by bracing her back against the wall and walking her feet up the stone face, a technique her father had used to examine the underside of bridge arches. The stone was rough enough to hold her boot soles. She moved slowly, testing each foothold before she shifted her weight. Her shoulders ached by the time she reached the 3rd intact rung, and she hung there for a moment with her forearms hooked over the rung and her breathing steady before she pulled herself up and through the central opening in the partition floor. She went through head first, the lamp held out in front of her, and for a second the opening was tight around her shoulders, and she had a clear sense of the 12 feet of air beneath her and the stone floor far below. And then she was through, and the lamp was out in front of her in the dark upper chamber, and the smell that had been waiting all those years came to her at once. The upper chamber was sealed. It had been sealed, she could tell from the quality of the air when she cleared the opening, for years. The air that rose past her face as she came through was dry and cold and carried the faint metallic smell of old paper and dust undisturbed. The smell was specific. She recognized it from her father's work with old construction documents, the particular combination of parchment, dried ink, and still air that had not moved in a long time. It was the smell of a thing that had been put away and left. The upper chamber was the same diameter as the lower, 12 feet across, and its floor was the upper face of the partition slabs, which had been planked over with boards of milled timber, tongue and groove, tight enough that the plank floor had kept moisture from penetrating despite the years. She held the lamp out in a slow arc and let the light move around the chamber. The walls were smooth here, the interior face of the upper courses showing less weathering than the lower because they had been sealed. No vine roots coming through the mortar. No frost-heave cracks at the base of the courses. The cap of the silo, where the lean was greatest and where she had expected to find the most damage, showed one open joint near the southeast face, a gap of perhaps a 1/4 inch through which a thin bar of gray October sky was visible, and through which, at this time of day, a stripe of pale light fell across the plank floor. A small wooden crate sat against the wall to her left. 2 canvas-wrapped parcels sat beside it. A leather portfolio, the kind used by surveyors and engineers, lay flat on the plank floor in the center of the chamber, weighted at its corners by 4 river stones. She set the lamp down on the planks and crouched and looked at the portfolio without touching it. The leather was dry and undamaged. The river stones had been placed deliberately, one at each corner, not at random, and they were matched in size, which meant someone had selected them with care. The portfolio had not been dropped in a hurry. It had been placed. She crouched over the portfolio for a long time before she opened it, not from hesitation, from the recognition that what she was looking at was the reason the silo had been built the way it had been built, the reason a man who could not afford good labor had spent extra on a partition floor that nobody outside his family would ever know existed. She opened it. The portfolio held 4 sets of documents. The first was the original survey field notes from the 1864 preemption filing, comprising the traverse calculations, the chain measurements, and the bearing records, all in a careful hand on long paper, unfaded. The second was a copy of the same filing made in 1870, annotated in a different hand in red ink, with corrections to the traverse that brought the description into full conformity with the legal section lines. The third was a letter dated March 1871, signed by a surveyor named Halford, who was known to Dora from the county records as an employee of the Meridian Valley Agricultural Corporation, in which Halford described to an unnamed superior the method he intended to use to introduce a discrepancy into the recorded survey description. The letter was candid to a degree that suggested Halford believed it would never be read by anyone other than its recipient. The fourth set of documents was the Dresslers' own running record of their land payments, with dates, amounts, and receipts stapled with wire, covering the years 1864 through 1871, in the cramped German-language hand that Dora associated from the assessor's records with Friedrich Dressler himself. She stayed in the upper chamber for a long time, after she had read through everything once. Outside, the October sun was moving west. A thin line of it came through a gap in the upper wall, where a mortar joint had opened slightly near the cap, and it lay across the plank floor in a pale stripe. She read Halford's letter a second time. She read the annotated copy of the survey a second time. Then she laid everything back in order, closed the portfolio, and sat with her back against the stone wall in the cold and the quiet and the smell of old paper and the particular stillness of a thing that has been sealed a long time and is now open. She descended the next morning. She brought the portfolio and the canvas-wrapped parcels, which proved to contain additional land payment records and correspondence between Friedrich Dressler and a lawyer in Lawrence who had represented the family in the 1871 contest, and whose letters made clear that he had believed from the beginning that the survey discrepancy was introduced rather than discovered. The wooden crate held 12 glass jars of milled grain, sealed with wax, undamaged, and a small tin box. In the tin box were 4 photographs of the Dressler family, taken in what appeared to be 1868 or 1869. Friedrich and his wife, Clara, their 2 adult sons, and a daughter-in-law posed in front of the silo when it was new and straight, its mortar still pale with fresh lime. She looked at the photographs for a moment. Then she packed the tin carefully in the satchel beside the deed. The county seat of Harlan was 12 miles west. She made the trip in a borrowed wagon, the portfolio on the seat beside her, the satchel between her feet. The road was dry enough in October that the wheels raised a fine dust that settled over everything, and she arrived at the county offices with the portfolio under her arm and the shawl grayed again at the shoulders. She did not stop to brush it off. She went inside and asked for the county recorder. She was not a lawyer, and she did not pretend to know the exact form the remedy would take. What she knew was that the documents in the portfolio constituted a record of deliberate fraud in a land proceeding, that Halford's letter in particular was the kind of evidence that did not admit of innocent interpretation, and that there were people in Harlan County and in Topeka who had authority over such things, and who, if presented with such evidence in the correct form, would be compelled to act on it. The county recorder, a man named Elias Pruitt, received her in his office with the particular wariness that officials in small counties develop toward women who arrive unannounced with leather portfolios. He was a deliberate man, mid-50s, with the quality of stillness that some bureaucrats develop over a long career of reading documents that lie and documents that do not. He looked at the portfolio and then at her and said he was listening. She placed the documents on his desk in the order she had found them. She did not explain them. She let him read. He read the Halford letter in silence. His expression did not change while he read it. He set it aside, placed the annotated survey beside it, read the survey with the same silence, and then looked up at her. He asked her 3 questions. The first was where she had found the documents. The second was whether she had removed anything from the portfolio before bringing it to him. The third was whether she had spoken to anyone else about what she had found. She answered each question clearly and briefly. She had found the documents in the upper chamber of the stone silo on the Dressler ground, which she had purchased at the county auction on October the 14th. She had removed nothing from the portfolio before bringing it to him. She had spoken to no one else. He nodded once at each answer and looked back at the documents. Then he said he would need to contact the state land office in Topeka and that the matter would take some time to move through the proper channels. She said that was fine. She gave him her address, which was a boarding house on the Drover Road, and she drove home. There were descendants. The elder Dressler's son, a man named Ernst who had moved to Nebraska in 1876 after the land loss and was farming a rented quarter section near Hastings, was located through a chain of correspondence that took 6 weeks. A letter was sent to him by the county recorder's office. He wrote back within a fortnight. He came to Harlan in January, arriving on the morning coach. A careful man in his middle 40s with a weathered face and hands that showed years of field work, who spoke with a German inflection at the edges of his sentences, and who had dressed formally for the occasion in a coat that was clean and well kept, even if it was not new. He brought his oldest son, a young man of 20 who stood near the wall and said nothing throughout the meeting. Ernst Dressler sat in the recorder's office and read the portfolio documents with a steadiness that only broke once, briefly, when he came to his father's handwritten payment record. He had not wept on any of the other documents. On the payment record, he stopped reading and was still for a moment, his hands flat on the paper. She, sitting across the room at Pruitt's invitation as the finder of the documents, watched him without looking directly at him. She was occupied with the window, which looked out onto the January street, gray and frozen, a pair of horses at the hitching rail. He set the paper down on the desk and was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, simply, that he had always believed his father had kept a record somewhere, but that after the second loss they had thought the record must have been in the house and gone with it when the house passed to the company in 1874. She told him where the record had been. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said that his father had built that second floor himself, alone, in the last winter before the first suit was filed, and had told nobody in the family exactly what he put in it, only that it was safe and that they should not worry. She thought about what that meant, a man telling his family not to worry, putting his evidence in stone and sealing it, and going about the business of the farm. She thought about the partition floor, the matched river stones, the leather portfolio placed in the center of the room. It was not the work of a man in panic. It was the work of a man who had made his preparation and then decided to trust it and to go on living. After the meeting, as she was crossing the courthouse square in the January cold, the young man caught up with her on the steps. He was 20, she had estimated, and he had his grandfather's look about the jaw. He asked her what she had thought when she first saw the portfolio on the floor of the upper chamber. She considered the question. Then she said that her first thought had been that the river stones were well matched, and that a man who matched his stones had probably matched everything else he did too. The young man looked at her for a moment and then nodded, as if this answered something he had been carrying for a while. He went back across the square to his father. The Meridian Valley Agricultural Corporation had operated in eastern Kansas from 1868 to 1889. By the time the Dressler complaint was formally reviewed by the state land office in the spring of 1884, the corporation's principals had shifted their holdings several times, and 2 of its founding partners were dead. The land office proceeding moved slowly, as such proceedings did, through a sequence of filings and counterfilings, and the testimony of a retired surveyor in Topeka, who examined the original field notes and the annotated copy and confirmed in writing that the traverse corrections in the annotated copy were accurate and that the description as recorded had been altered. Halford, by then living in Missouri, did not respond to correspondence. The process did not require him to. The documents spoke in his place. She received a copy of each filing as it was produced, because Pruitt, who had taken on the matter with the kind of slow, deliberate interest she was coming to recognize as his characteristic mode, had arranged for her to be listed as the locating party on the complaint. She read each document as it arrived at the boarding house, checked it against what she knew of the portfolio's contents, and set it aside in a folder she kept in the satchel. There was a period, in the summer of 1884, when no filings came for 6 weeks, and she had no information about the state of the proceedings. She did not go to the recorder's office to ask. She went on with her piece labor on the Drover Road, relaying a chimney on a farmstead to the north, and doing an assessment of a bridge abutment for a road contractor out of Emporia who had heard of her work from a man she had never met. She was paid fairly for the bridge work, which was new. She wrote the amount in the notebook. The 6 weeks ended with a brief letter from Pruitt's office saying the State Land Office had formally accepted the complaint for review and that the next stage would take some months. She read the letter twice and put it with the others. Some months meant what it said. It meant winter. The western 2/3 of the original Dressler claim was reassigned to him in the autumn of 1885, minus the portions that had been sold on to subsequent buyers in good faith, for which a monetary settlement was calculated against the corporation's remaining Kansas assets. The settlement was not large. He used it to purchase the balance of his rented Nebraska quarter section and to send his oldest son to a teaching college. He wrote to her twice, once when the reassignment was confirmed, and once, the following spring, to tell her that he had come back to the Harlan land with his son and walked it, and that the silo was still standing. She was still there, in Harlan County. She had stayed because there was work. The county recorder, Pruitt, after the Dressler matter, had found her a contract position assessing the structural condition of county-held buildings, work she was qualified for, and that paid at the rate the men were paid, because Pruitt was a careful man who did not want complaints about the assessments she produced. She bought a small house on the north edge of town in 1886 with money she had saved over 3 years of contract work. She kept her father's satchel and her father's tools, and she kept the partition floor notes from his notebooks, copied in her own hand, into a new notebook she had bought for the purpose. The silo stood for another 12 years after the autumn she climbed into it. She could see it from the Drover Road on the occasions she had work in that direction. It leaned its 3 degrees off plumb toward the southeast, the same angle it had always leaned, unchanged by what had been found inside it or by the legal proceedings it had set in motion. In 1895, a dry summer followed by a wet freeze cracked the southeast mortar course at last, and the structure was taken down by a crew of hired men who sold the limestone for a road project. She heard about it from Pruitt, who mentioned it in passing. She did not go to watch. What remained was the land around where the silo had stood, the packed earth of the foundation pad, the short grass that grew in the circle the walls had shaded, and, if you knew where to look, the slight subsidence of the ground where the footing stones had been pulled. A person who didn't know what had stood there would see nothing particular. A person who knew would see the place where a man named Friedrich Dressler, in the last winter of his hope, had built a second floor in the dark and placed his evidence there and sealed it and said nothing, trusting that the stone was strong enough to hold until someone capable of reading it came along. There is a particular patience in that kind of trust, not blind hope, not desperate wishing, but the quiet certainty of a man who understood that stone does not lie if it is laid right, that a thing sealed dry will keep, and that the right hands would come to it eventually. She had been those hands. She carried the satchel until 1921, when she gave it, with the notebooks and the tools, to a young woman named Ruth, who had come to her asking about masonry work, and who had the same quality of stillness in the way she listened that Dora recognized from her own years of learning at her father's side. Ruth was 22. She had a notebook of her own in which she had already begun writing down what she observed about structures. Dora told her two things when she gave her the satchel. The first was that a lean is not the same as a fall, and you should always determine which you are looking at before you walk away. The second was that a structure has a memory, and that memory is in the stone, and that patience and the right tools will read it. If you have found something that others overlooked, or held on to a thing that everyone around you said was finished, leave that in the comments. What she uncovered in the leaning silo at the edge of the old Dressler ground was not luck, and it was not accident. It was the meeting of one man's careful preparation and one woman's inherited gift for reading what stone had to say. The rest of the stories on this channel are made of the same material. Stay close to them. This story draws on the documented practices of German immigrant homesteaders in eastern Kansas and the history of federal preemption land claims in the post-Civil War period. Dora Vance, the Dressler family, and the Meridian Valley Agricultural Corporation are fictional, created for this dramatization.